that's great. Ah, that's cool. No, nice to put a face to a name. Yeah. Oh, you are? Oh, cool. Well, hi, Gabriel. I didn't know whether you were here or not. Good to see you, Gabriel. How you doing? Hadn't seen you in a while. There we go.
Thank you.
Oh, and I'll give this to you.
Yeah, I
since you're
would think
first.
so.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
So I think we'll get started here in a second. If everyone wants to sit down and
Session. Yeah.
get ready for the panel.
I brought this back for you.
Oh.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandon Dittman, and I'm an associate at the law firm of Kissinger and Fellman, which is out of Denver, Colorado. If you couldn't tell by the color of my tie, go Broncos. And we are all here for the. I heard the Seattle people booing out there. So we're all here for the Telecom Update 2018 panel, which is my privilege to moderate. We have a really distinguished panel with us today. We have Zach, who's a director of government affairs at the Wireless Infrastructure Association, so it gives a little industry insight on small cells 2018. We also have with us Tim, who's with Spiegel McDermott, one of the really well-known DC law firms. And if you've ever been on our policy and legal calls, definitely one of the familiar voices on those calls. Finally, we have Angelina with the National League of Cities, going to give us an update on the federal stuff that's going on and their great advocacy there. And so I'm not going to try and take up too much of the time, so I just wanted to have everyone give a big round of applause for all the speakers as we get going. So first we're going to have Zach talk first.
Well, thank you for being here. Privileged to speak before you today. I'm glad this is after the lunch panel. Normally folks think that's the sleepier panel, but I'm glad the cutlery, the forks and knives have been taken away, and so we'll get into it. But where am I pointing? Here?
Is it on?
I don't know.
Don't see the red light on, so try the on-off button.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Go back, I guess. I don't know.
Should be.
There we go. So I'm here to speak to you about sort of the industry perspective on 5G deployment and some of what we're working together on. If you're not familiar with WIA, we're the Wireless Infrastructure Association. We're based out of now Arlington, Virginia. We have a staff of several folks that are working on education for training in the field, as well as government affairs and advocacy. Visit our booth this week. You'll see my colleagues Kayla Gardner and Arturo Chang there as well. So some of our members include wireless carriers, the infrastructure providers, the folks that are making antennas, and the groups that knit that all together, the folks that find the land to lease, the folks that aggregate the technologies and deploy and update. Members include the AT&Ts and T-Mobiles of the world, the Crown Castles, American Towers, and also Mosaic under UCLA. And then also the farming sector, we have companies like John Deere, which are bringing 5G technologies to rural America for smart farming. So I think if you've been here today, yesterday, you'll understand sort of the impetus for our accelerated work to get 5G deployed. The demand for wireless connectivity and data itself is never ending. A couple stats I'll give to you. You're probably familiar with the Cisco estimate, but the Cisco estimate shows that mobile traffic data grew 63% in 2016. Cisco estimated that 69% of the mobile traffic runs over 4G networks. Mobile video makes up 60% of that. And more Americans are using their devices on average of 5 hours a day. And a recent study also found that in each American has 1.2 devices per capita. So I think many of you have a couple cell phones and connectivity that would contribute to this ever-growing demand. This is not on 5G. This is probably unlicensed.
Yes.
Next slide, please. Okay. So 5G has a number of benefits to communities. One of those you'll see is the contribution to GDP. It's estimated that 5G will yield $500 billion over the next few years, and $275 billion in new wireless investment, as well as jobs to build that out and maintain those networks. 4.7 million jobs depend on wireless, and with that, a number of jobs for 5G specifically. Part of that is we have a workforce crunch, and WIA is working with federal entities, state entities to train the next generation of workers in RF design to make sure that we solve that skills gap. The benefits of 5G are numerous. I won't spend too much time here today. I know we have a number of policy items we want to get to, but as you saw on the Smart Communities track yesterday and throughout the conference, there's services that communities can avail themselves of. We've all heard of, I think, the smart trash collection and those sorts of things, but it goes beyond that to inventory management and connecting better with communities across the states. Beyond that, there's telemedicine and connectivity. So if you're in rural America and you have fast connection, you can have access to the greatest hospitals in the world. There's also increased learning opportunities that come from 5G, and then public safety. I think recently folks found that 80% of 911 calls originated from a wireless device. There's also the FirstNet mandate of building out a interoperable public safety network that all states have signed on to now that would require 99% connectivity, and a lot of that will come from LTE and wireless spectrum. Just a quick overview of some of the technologies that go into 5G. I know we've heard some conversation about when's 5G coming, and is this 4G or is this densification? For our part, we would say it's all of that. The 5G standard, as you know, will be rolled out in 2020, but there's trials that are taking place now. But the foundation for that network includes densification and facilities to attach to. We're all familiar with the tower, which is the backbone of the wireless network. Those are single, self-standing real estate where you can have multiple tenants on there. They provide broad coverage. They too will have 5G antennas in the coming years, but they provide an overlay for the network. Those larger facilities can also be on rooftops or side-mounted, providing access in that way. And then what I think we're all kind of talking about today is small cells in the right-of-way or on public infrastructure, on existing utilities, utility poles, light stands, bus stops, and those sorts of things. So collectively, this is what's in the toolkit today and what our members are utilizing to deploy wireless. Next slide, please. Sorry. Next slide. Okay, so policy agenda, I know collectively we'll get through all this. Going to the White House and Congress first, I know Angelina and my other colleagues up here will speak to. There was an omnibus bill that was passed. There was also some efforts on an FAA reauthorization. Some of you may have seen this. The FAA enacted a bill, or Congress enacted a bill that would have required many structures inside many of your communities to be marked or lit to protect from, rural crop dusters and those sorts of things. We found it was like an errant addition to the bill, and we're working to get that out. Many of those structures were approved, noting that they wouldn't be marked or lit, and to have retroactively a requirement that these items be lit in communities where they were otherwise unexpected, I don't think would do a service to any of us. Next slide, please. I think Angelina will speak to the Streamlined Deployment Act as well. That's a bipartisan bill in Congress with Chairman Thune and Senator Schatz from Hawaii. This is looking at streamlining sort of the timelines and the structures for applications of small cells in communities. WIA is speaking with the authors. We have some adjustments that we're seeking. I'll speak to our state efforts also. I think we're looking to make sure that what's happening in all these different venues is compatible, and there's some tweaks we're seeking in this legislation. We're expecting perhaps a hearing on that later this fall. Next slide, please. The FCC has been extremely active. As you've seen, the most recent order had a one-touch make-ready aspect for attachments to polls. There was a clarification on moratoria. Previous to that, elements of historic environmental review were clarified as far as what's being deployed if there's less ground disturbance, if it's in a certain zone of a certain size. The environmental and historic review at the federal level would be accelerated, and then tribal review as well. An issue that many of our members have is deploying when they're deploying on land that is not tribal land. There's a historic interest that tribes can have where they can reach back to ancestral areas and seek review. The FCC clarified some of the shot clocks and adjustments for where and when and how fast that process should happen. Understand, as you all do, there's likely to be an FCC streamlining order on state and local processes. It could be out for public consumption and consideration as early as the 5th of September, which would put it available for a vote and action by the FCC. I think it's September 26th. And then within that tracking is the BDAC, the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, which has been tackling state model codes and model ordinances, federal lands deployment. What does the process look like on National Park Service land to get broadband out to a visitor center? Those sorts of things are being taken up by the FCC. And while not part of the official docket per se, they are something that the FCC is looking at and considering as these orders have been rolled out. We're working in the states, so 20 bills have been signed by legislatures, a great number of those bipartisan. Michigan and Pennsylvania, as you may, since we're in Philadelphia this week, Pennsylvania has an active bill as well, and we'd expect more of these bills to be introduced in the coming session. We've run some quick numbers. This is over half the population, I believe, is served by these bills. Let me tell you a little bit about what's in the bills if you're... Next slide, please. So the bills include streamlined small cell deployment, specifically to the right-of-way. They include shot clocks for municipal approval. They include elements like a denial that would be in writing and contemporaneous with the denial. They also address fees and make clarifications between application fee, access fee, and rental fee. One of the elements that is within this legislation that WIA worked strongly to include is a preference and consideration that state and local entities have the opportunity to look to co-location and can consider that before citing additional facilities. So we were very strongly looking to include that, and we're happy to say those 20 bills largely have that aspect in there. We've also worked to help define the height and volume of those facilities, helping to better define and distinguish between a macro cell versus a small cell. Understand there's some controversy about where folks would like to see that. But we do have cumulative limits, and we do have caps on height as well that we strongly advocate for in all of these legislatures. I'll be brief. I'm nearly finished. Update for 2019. I think it's important to note that midterm elections are coming. That'll shape and shift a bit of what the state legislatures look like. It'll also shift what Congress looks like. Largely, this has been bipartisan, but we're looking to see how that might affect aspects. As you may know, I think I see more of this as a rural-urban sort of conversation than it is blue-red, but we're tracking that closely. Already mentioned the Streamline Act. There were over a dozen bills introduced in the House earlier this spring. We don't see that abating as far as interest in this issue. The state and local order, which I mentioned. BDAC is, its charter runs out, I think, early next year. Some of the recommendations are nearly final. There's a rates and fees item. There's the model code and state municipal ordinance that are nearly finished. And then there are a number of states that have not enacted legislation yet. Well, yeah, not trying to hide anything from you. No, I'll just tell you, we'll get it to NATOA for posting. There's a number of things that we're working on, and some of them are at our booth this week. There's the WIA Innovation and Technology Council has put out a number of white papers to try and update the public about what these technologies look like dimensionally and I guess forecasting the future. I already mentioned the Telecommunications Education Center, which is looking to train folks in communities across the country to partake in the $1 billion being spent on 5G deployment. And then we're also working with our state wireless associations, which are independent volunteer organizations across the country with workforces in their states and communities. And then also we're part of the City Networks Task Force, which has presented to local cities and communities in the past and shared some exchanges in that way. And I think that's it. Apologies for the technical difficulties.
Well, thank you, Zach, and we'll have opportunity for questions at the end. Next, we're going to go to Tim, who's going to talk about, from a more local perspective, about some of the issues at the FCC and we're dealing with right now.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, we are up. Good. And we're going to have the same song and dance here again.
This is how you can tell it's a technology panel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because none of the technology works.
Whoops, went too far. Okay. Yeah, it's an overview as I'll do my usual demarcation and talk some about what's going on at the FCC, some what's going on at the courts, and on the Hill. I'll probably, particularly given time constraints, be a little brief on the Hill. I'll hand that off to Angelina. She spends a lot more time on the Hill than I do, so she'll give you a better feel for the temperature there than I probably. Although I will make I can't resist one remark on what Zach said, and that is he said the distinction is more of an urban-rural one rather than a blue-red one. And as far as I can tell, actually the blue-red distinction is sort of an urban-rural distinction if you look at the voting thing. So, but onward and upward, I'll go first to the FCC, and one very big topic is, that's too bad, it's not the RFI order. I always like to call it the RIF order. For some of those who might know what a RIF is, but it's the FCC's calls it the Restoring Internet Freedom Order that was issued early this year. It basically undid the order that and I might as well call it this way, we had the, Sure. We have basically what the RIF order did is it undid the 2015 Open Internet Order that and you might as well to distinguish between the two, what the Wheeler or Obama FCC did and now what the Trump or Pai FCC did. Basically reversed the order. Now, what does that mean by undoing the order? Well, the 2015 order classified retail broadband service as a telecommunications service. And what that means is, generally speaking, under the Communications Act, if it is a telecommunications service, it has to be made available without unreasonable discrimination on non-discriminatory terms, rates, and conditions. Whereas information service, the other categorization is basically deregulated. It's the free market argument that providers can do whatever they wish with it, provide it to who they want, refuse to provide it to who they want, and also edit, throttle, and control as they see fit. A lot of the tug of war about this is, I guess, boils down to your trust for the marketplace. Does the marketplace take care of the broadband service like it does peanut butter at your grocery store? And that is the tug of war. If I'll go over here, and yeah, the basic premise is that broadband service under the current FCC's view is it really is just like any good or service, sort of like a toaster. We don't need special regulatory oversight of this service at all. We can rely upon the marketplace, and if there are abuses or market power, we can rely upon the Federal Trade Commission and antitrust lawsuits to take care of any problem with broadband. As long as there's a little bit of transparency on disclosure of speeds, the RIF order does contain one remaining regulatory requirement that it watered down the transparency and disclosure requirements of the prior FCC's order, but it retains some very watered down versions. There's a little bit of a tension with that because the FCC also did something. It didn't just say that it chose to reclassify the service as information service. It construed the Communications Act to say that we, the FCC, do not have jurisdiction over this service, largely. We can't call it telecommunications service anymore, even if we wanted to. Interesting footnote, the court, the DC Circuit, had upheld the prior ruling that it was okay to classify it as telecom service. But this FCC has concluded that, nope, tie the hands. They're clearly trying to tie the hand of future FCCs. But that they cannot do any more than that. The sort of weird contradiction in that is they felt a need to keep the transparency rules, but the problem is that the very justification for the transparency rules, the legal justification, they sort of declined by saying we don't have really any jurisdiction over this service anymore. As you might expect, the FCC's order is going to be appealed, and in fact has been appealed. The appeal is pending, and briefing is taking place right now. That will play over onto some other issues, and the big issue that we just finished talking about, has been talked about a lot at the conference, and Zach talked about it, and that's the FCC's wireless wireline infrastructure proceedings. There are actually two different dockets. One is for wireless infrastructure and one is for wireline. The FCC has sort of, issued separate orders in each, although they overlap quite a bit. It is, to a certain degree, it's an artificial distinction because, yes, you can think of wireless facilities if you think of transmitter and receiver facilities located on a pole or located on a macro tower, but all wireless facilities attached to landline somewhere sooner or later, usually sooner rather than later. And so the backhaul facilities also roll into it, and that's why you have both wireline and wireless facilities. I guess I am getting ahead of myself here. Let's see. Yes, I did. That's it. Yep, here we are. I'll start off with the wireless docket, and I'm going through the orders. There actually have been 3 relevant orders on the wireless side. The first 2 dealt primarily with, as Zach mentioned before, National Historic Preservation Act and National Environmental Protection Act review of telecommunications facilities. The FCC has rules because those acts require the FCC to have a review procedure for any sort of telecommunications facilities installations that are viewed as significant, but the FCC by rule gets to define those. The FCC basically, in 2 different orders, created an exemption for replacement utility poles that wouldn't require FCC review, and it also excluded small cells with a definition of those from historic preservation and environmental review, and also streamlined environmental and historic preservation for review of larger wireless facilities. How that relates to state and local preemption is that is not preemptive in and of itself. State and local zoning laws and state and local access laws still apply. It just means that there's no longer any federal overlay environmental or historical preservation review of those facilities. It's all on the state or local government. But in the process, and if passed as prologue, the FCC sort of defined small cells in deciding what the scope of the exemption from the federal environmental and historic preservation review was. And the FCC usually, once it defines something like small cells, and there's a fight back and forth, it will then attach match that, use that same definition when it comes around to preempting state and local governments or defining what is a small cell for purposes of forthcoming FCC rules limiting state and local authority over the installation of those facilities. So in that sense, the definition in that proceeding is relevant. It's interesting that the second order, that you see up there, is NATOA filed a reconsideration petition that is pending of that order, but in addition, a whole series of Native American tribes, because it limited, as Zach mentioned, the order addressed tribal review of wireless facilities and limited fees and limited time frames for review, and several tribes have appealed that ruling, and that appeal is pending in the DC Circuit as well. I keep jumping by the one I wanted to get to. It keeps going by, and I like my little emoji, but I can't seem to get him to stay. Okay, now we're talking about the most recent order, and that is the FCC's declaratory ruling, which was issued I guess just a little over a month ago. And in that ruling, what the FCC did is it preempted explicit and de facto moratoria on the deployment of any sort of communications networks. Now, by its terms, it isn't really just wireless, it's any sort of communications networks. There's a couple of interesting issues about the declaratory ruling, at least a couple of interesting legal issues. One is the FCC chose to rely only on Section 253, which is the general barriers to entry provision of the 1996 Act, and not 332C7, which is the wireless siting provision, even though a lot of the discussion in the declaratory ruling is about moratoria on wireless facilities, in particular small cell facilities as well. And that presents an interesting legal issue because 332C7, which is the wireless siting provision of the 96 Act, its first subparagraph says, except as provided in the rest of 332C7, nothing in this Act, which, by the way, includes Section 253, limits or affects state or local authority or the placement, installation, or modification of wireless facilities. So there would seem to be a bit of a tension there. The declaratory ruling doesn't address that issue at all. The other interesting thing about the order is, of course, going back to when I was talking about the RIF order. Remember when I said the FCC reclassified broadband service to be an information service and not a telecommunications service? Well, Section 253, on which it relies, only prohibits state and local requirements that have the effect of prohibiting the provision of telecommunications service, not information services. The FCC knew that it has a little bit of a problem with that, so it tried to say that, well, if the facilities could be used for telecom service, then 253 applies. The problem is that I would argue they have to actually provide telecom service, and that's where my emoji friend comes up, because it's hard to identify any service that industry will concede is a telecom service anymore. If you go down, clearly data transmission, they'll say that's an information service. We know video service is not. Voice service, they might say, aha, what about voice service? Well, the problem is that most voice service, certainly that goes over wireless facilities, is now an internet protocol. And guess what? The FCC to this day has never said that voice over internet protocol service is a telecom service. It's been unwilling to say that. It has said that states can't regulate it, which makes it sort of start smelling like an information service, because whenever the FCC says states can't regulate it, it usually says that's an information service. So the question becomes, well, wait a minute, if nothing is a telecom service, then it would seem that 253 doesn't really apply. But that's an issue that's going to arise. I just pointed out as one that's a couple of big issues that are in the order, because the order the other thing the order says is one of the things it's not addressing. It's not addressing fees or compensation for use of local infrastructure or right-of-way or various other things. That's next on the agenda. Well, I'll go over the wireline docket pretty clearly, because remember I said there's a wireless docket and a wireline docket. There's sort of been going back and forth in orders in each. One of the interesting issues on the wireline side, and then I see Gabriel here from CPS in San Antonio, is one of the huge issues there has been pole attachments. I don't know how many people in this room have much to do with pole attachments. If you don't have much to do with them, you're probably thank your lucky stars, or at least be glad that your I's aren't crossed. Because it is a fairly obscure, detailed area, but it is a very large, significant area, because both for the attachment not just of wireless facilities, but for the additional attachment of wireline facilities to utility poles. And that's been a very big issue at the FCC. Historically, it's been a tug of war between the telecommunications industry on the one hand and the investor-owned utility industry on the other hand. And the FCC, of course, is the home court of the telecommunications industry, not the power industry. And historically, under pole attachment issues, the telecommunications industry has fared much better than the electric power industry on those rules. One thing that the FCC did in its most recent order, which was issued in the same document, by the way, as the declaratory ruling I was talking about a few minutes ago, was it adopted what is known as one-touch make-ready rules. I don't know, show of hands, how many of you ever heard of one-touch make-ready before? Oh, actually some hands out there. I won't go into too much detail on it. I will just say that historically, the FCC has not had a rule in that area, and I will say that, for the most part, obviously Google Fiber was a major pusher of one-touch make-ready. Also have been some competitive cable operators. Incumbent telephone companies and cable operators don't like it quite so much. They say, oh, we do, but they really don't. The issue is when you get several attachers to a poles under the FCC's, they're still the current rules because the new rules haven't gone into effect. You might have 3 or 4 or 5 attachers to a pole. Think of 4 or 5 sets of wires attached to a pole. Under the current rules, each existing attacher, let's say attacher number 5 comes and there's 4 attachers, each of the other 4 has their own time to move their own sets of wires. So number 5 has to sit and wait and twiddle its thumbs while attacher number 1, if it's necessary, moves theirs, then attacher number 2 gets an opportunity to move theirs, then number 3 gets to move theirs, then number 4 gets to move theirs, and then finally number 5 gets to move theirs. Well, one-touch make-ready, as its name suggests, is, well, why don't you have a single contractor approved by the pole owner who goes out with one truck roll and moves all the wires and installs new ones at the same time? And then we save everybody a lot of cost and expense. The FCC adopted a modified version of that. I will say that in one sense, weren't that many of them, but local governments have been sort of on the vanguard of one-touch make-ready. The FCC has finally come around to it. Certain municipal utilities have adopted. I mentioned CPS. Gabriel's here from San Antonio. Some cities have adopted it. Metro Louisville, Kentucky adopted it. Metro Nashville, Tennessee adopted it. Each of them were then pursued by the incumbent cable operator and the incumbent telephone company. Metro Nashville lost, Louisville Metro won, and the fight goes on. Kentucky's an unusual state in the sense that the FCC's pole attachment rules will not apply in Kentucky because Kentucky is a reverse preempted state, so only state law applies with respect to pole attachments in Kentucky, not the FCC rules. So in a state like Kentucky, unless the state or local government adopts one-touch make-ready, there won't be one-touch make-ready because even federal rules don't apply in a state like that. But that's probably more than I should have said about pole attachment. So I'll roll on. Yes, I clicked it too many times, so I stole my own thunder. But here, what's next, and we talked about it some before, is the FCC will issue an order or orders, it could be more than one, along the September, October, November timeframe. And what will those orders do? It could be one big single order, could be 2 or 3 separate orders. But what will they do? They will shorten the shot clocks that already exist for small cell providers. They will adopt a deemed granted remedy. In other words, if a locality does not act within a certain period of time, the application will be deemed granted. They will also compel access to state and local right-of-way and infrastructure. By that, what I mean is that historically, the wireless signing provision of the Act applied to land use applications. That is, locating telecom facilities on private property where a private property owner has already agreed to install the facilities. It's just an oversight land use. Here the issue is what small cell industry, and not just what all of industry wants, is access to rights of way and public infrastructure, light poles along the right of way and so forth. And that belongs to the local government, not to a private property owner. And its access to that is goal number one in this proceeding. And so this is going to basically present the question I talked about before. If I could have my friends exit. I don't know if they will. Yes, and then they can come back. One at a time, I hope. Ah, yes, there's the chicken. And particularly since we're in Philadelphia, there's the eagle. But basically, it's going to be an opportunity. Local governments are going to have to fight or roll over, but this is going to present it because this is going to be the only opportunity to present the issue. There are a lot of fascinating legal issues presented as a lawyer to me. I mean, can the federal government basically grant access to private industry to property that doesn't belong to the federal government? Can they do that? It's an interesting question. This will test that question. Can they set what the level of compensation is? And the other issue here is to set it at cost. And I know I've prattled on a little long. I will say one thing. I always find it ironic that today's FCC, their view is we don't regulate providers of communication services. They're all deregulated, the marketplace does it. But we do get to regulate somebody. We're going to regulate state and local governments. So we're going to get back in the rate regulation business. We haven't rate regulated for years. No one regulates communication service providers, but we will regulate the rates charged by state and local governments. But anyway, that is where we're heading, unless you want to go to war and fight about it, because that is what the FCC is going to do. I'm not going to discourage anyone to go to the FCC and lobby, but this FCC has made up its mind what it's going to do. I mean, don't kid yourself. Won't talk a lot about the BEAT Act. They've already done most of their work. There's a few things hanging out, but they've basically done all the damage they're going to do for the most part. I wanted to mention briefly on the video franchising. This actually relates back to the wireline infrastructure proceeding. Some of you may remember, many of you may not, that the FCC had a proceeding way back in the mid-aughts about video franchising, where it basically adopted rules and set shot clocks on granting new franchises to competitive cable operators and all sorts of things like that, who never showed up, by the way, even though that was the whole purpose of the proceeding. But the cable industry has come in on a remand of that proceeding from the Sixth Circuit of last year and said, well, we think they're getting into the wireless business too, as many of you know. They are hanging, wireless facilities off their cable or off their attachments on poles. And they're asking the FCC to rule that we can do that, in essence, free of charge. We're already paying 5% of our revenue on cable services, so we should be able to make these additional attachments without any separate telecom franchise fee or any sort of non-cable franchise fee. And we should be able to do it for the most part without even having to let the local government know or needing any permit. We can just roll out there and put that stuff up. And that's what the cable industry is asking the FCC to do in that docket. Won't spend a lot of time on the Supreme Court. There's two decisions that could affect local governments a lot. For those of you who have state, who rely on sales and use taxes, the first decision, South Dakota versus Wayfair, is huge. It overruled an earlier Supreme Court decision that said that remote online sales or catalog sales could not be taxed in a state and local jurisdiction unless there was a physical presence of the retailer in the jurisdiction. That decision was overruled. The second decision, Murphy versus NCAA, has to do with gambling, but the interesting thing about it from state and local government's point of view is the Supreme Court reinvigorated what is a doctrine which began about 30 or 40 years ago called the anti-commandeering doctrine. What it basically says is that the federal government cannot, in essence, commandeer state and local government facilities or authorities for federal purposes. If the federal government wants to do it, it should do it itself and pay for it itself. It shouldn't commandeer state and local government resources to carry out federal policies. And since I'm running over, I think I will bow on the hill. The first appeal is, it's interesting, I could digress a lot on it. Let's just say that the Ninth Circuit clarified that the Federal Trade Commission does have authority over the non-common carrier actions of telecommunications service providers. district court in that case had ruled otherwise. This was actually a critical decision for the current FCC because had the court gone the other way, that would have meant literally no one had authority over broadband service, neither the FCC nor the Federal Trade Commission, but the court came out this way. Mozilla is the appeal of the FCC's RIF order I talked about earlier, and United Kituwa Band is the tribe's appeal of the second report and order in the wireless infrastructure proceeding that I talked about. They're all pending. And now we're on the Hill, and on the Hill, I will die on the Hill and hand it over to Angelina.
Well, thank you, Tim. That was great. We need to move on to Angelina. Who's going to talk about the Hill.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Well, I'll get started by introducing myself. I'm Angelina Panettiere. I'm with the National League of Cities. And for those of you who aren't familiar with NLC, NLC is one of NATOA's sister organizations, and I take that very seriously because this year especially, I have probably had weeks and months where I've talked more to Nancy than I have my own family. But we work very closely together along with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National Association of Counties, all of the state municipal leagues. We're all in this together. And we're really busy this year fighting efforts in Washington and a lot of your state capitals to preempt local governments. I think there's a sentiment in Washington right now in particular that local government is a problem. Rather than being a laboratory of democracy and innovation, it's stymieing business progress. And so I think we have a bit of a PR problem as a sector, and I think it's incumbent upon us to do a lot of education and outreach to our officials to change that perspective. Yep, can everyone hear me? Nobody's miming at their ears, so I think I'm good. That's not usually the problem I have. Usually I'm too short for microphones. But an example of this PR problem that we have in the August FCC open meeting, Commissioner Mike O'Reilly claimed that local officials were deliberately obstructing broadband infrastructure deployment as an ego boost and extracting slush funds from wireless companies to prevent broadband from reaching their residents. So this is the attitude that we're combating. And now it's my turn to have problems with this. Oh. Okay. So as Tim mentioned, I'm going to focus on what we've been doing on the Hill. I think I'm the only non-attorney at this table, so I'm going to be focusing more on the how than the legal questions. I'll direct those to these guys. But as the folks who spoke before me mentioned, broadband is a real topic of interest on the Hill right now. It's a bipartisan issue, especially as we're looking at this urban-rural divide. Zach touched on that a little bit, and I agree with him that we're seeing on a lot of political issues, but especially on this one, a sharp divide between what people have in urban areas and what they may or may not have in rural areas. And unfortunately, agreeing on this problem on both sides of the aisle does not mean that we necessarily agree on a solution. But it is really encouraging to see Congress agree that this is something we should be looking at. So to that end, they've had a number of hearings on broadband and telecom issues this year. Most of the FCC oversight hearings have focused on issues around the net neutrality order and the comment process for the net neutrality order. So unfortunately, we haven't necessarily dug into some of those nitty-gritty infrastructure and infrastructure funding issues. But both chambers of Congress have addressed that in separate hearings. This photo is of Mayor Gary Resnick from Wilton Manors, Florida. He testified back in March at a hearing focused on wireless infrastructure. And as Zach mentioned, we're hearing from the co-sponsors of the Streamline Act that they're interested in having a hearing about it this fall. There's not a lot of fall left before the election, but if they do manage to squeeze a hearing in, we'll be pushing hard to have a local representative as a witness. The other major thing on deck related to telecom for the Senate in particular right now is a lot of confirmations. The FCC is currently down one commissioner, and a Democrat, Jeffrey Starks, has been nominated to fill the vacancy created by Commissioner Clyburn leaving. But unfortunately, the delay on a lot of these nominations is trying to package them together. They're negotiating. They want to reconfirm Commissioner Carr and Commissioner Starks at the same time. Hopefully that'll happen before the election. After that, I think we're going to be dealing with a lot of spending drama, assuming that we can't get it taken care of before then. And that's when things will really start to get fun. having the same problem. And then, as Zach touched on, the spending bill this year was really the major vehicle for a lot of serious broadband infrastructure legislation. Probably the biggest victory for us in that one was the creation of a $600 million rural broadband pilot program within the USDA. And I'll touch on this a little bit more later, but for those of you who are interested, they have put out a notice of inquiry, and they're asking questions about how they should implement that program. If you are in or work with a rural area, I really encourage you to take a look at that and provide some feedback. The other things that were rolled up into that spending omnibus were the Mobile Now Act, which primarily focused on wireless issues as they relate to federal regulations, federal processes, federal lands, and also the FCC reauthorization. That one is interesting because it contains a number of provisions around studies and data gathering. So for example, the FCC just closed 2 comment periods requesting feedback on the state of wireless and wireline competition in the US. NLC and NATOA commented on both of those. They're also looking into ways of how we can incentivize state and local governments to provide data on infrastructure that could be used to mount wireless equipment on. So the legislation requires that federal agencies contribute to a database of what assets they have that could be used to place wireless equipment. It doesn't compel state and local governments to do anything, but they are most likely going to be reaching out to your organizations, maybe to you directly, to find out what would possibly compel you to contribute to this database, what you would find appealing or useful about it. I've already had some conversations with folks about that, and I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, but they are required to look into this by the end of the year, and there's not a lot of that left. And then the other thing, I almost feel like it's been talked about a lot already, but the Streamlined Small Cell Deployment Act is probably the most serious piece of currently moving legislation on telecom issues on the Hill right now. As Zach and Tim mentioned, it is a bipartisan bill that was introduced by Chairman Thune of the Senate Commerce Committee and Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii. That is intended to, frankly, preempt state and local control of their own rights of way in order to expedite the deployment of small cell facilities. So it would create a new shot clock structure specifically for small cells. It would implement a deemed granted remedy. So for the local governments that overrun this new shot clock, these applications would automatically be deemed granted. And another major thing that it would do is limit the fee and rate structures for local governments. So most local governments are already limited by their states to make application fees be limited to the cost of doing business for those fees. This would also limit recurring rental rates for locating on public property or in the rights of way to the direct and actual cost. This is a philosophical argument that we've been having in a lot of state capitals and with the FCC, and it has come up again in this legislation. And just like WIA, NLC has been in to meet with the bill's co-authors and a lot of the folks on the Senate Commerce Committee. I don't think we have minor tweaks so much as a major philosophical disagreement with the bill's existence, but we are trying to have the conversation with them and see, a little quibble, and see what there is that we can do to work productively together on this issue. One of the things that we have tried to convey to all of our legislators is that cities and their residents do in fact want better wireless service. They want to take advantage of next generation technology. We just want to make sure that we're going about it deliberately and not unduly limiting the authority of local governments. So I will go into a little bit more, and actually before I get on to the BDAC, one more thing I wanted to mention is that the Streamline Act does not have a House companion right now, and the only co-sponsors are the original authors. But I think that means this is a real opportunity for all of us to do some education with our legislators. One thing that I've noticed in meeting with folks on the Hill is that, believe it or not, small cell deployment is a really niche issue, and it's not top of mind for most people on the Hill. It's not their most pressing concern. And they don't necessarily know how local governments operate. They don't necessarily know what equipment looks like or how it fits into a streetscape or what sorts of conversations you're having with your residents. So this is our opportunity to be proactive, to reach out to these officials and let them know that we want to work with them, but this is not the approach we want to take. Especially since there hasn't been a hearing yet and there isn't a House companion, talking to both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Hill is a really good use of your time. So moving across Washington over to the FCC, I'm not going to dig into the rulemakings, thank God, because Tim has already handled that ably, but I am going to talk about the BDAC because we've been pretty vocal on this issue. And so for those of you who have managed to avoid hearing about this for the last year and a half, the BDAC stands for the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. This is a project that was announced by Chairman Pai at the end of his first open meeting as chairman last year. And it was a group that was formed to provide the federal government with policy recommendations on how to identify and remove barriers to broadband deployment. And they were also specifically instructed to create model codes for state and local governments to deploy broadband. And I should clarify, that doesn't mean deploy municipal broadband. That means easing the deployment of broadband infrastructure by somebody. So we got together with NATOA last year and submitted a lot of names, wrote a lot of endorsement letters, recommended a large number of local officials who stepped forward to volunteer. And when the group met for the first time, precisely one of them had been appointed in a group of about 30 people. We were not pleased. So we met repeatedly with the FCC and advocated for a better balance of representation on this committee. We had some limited success. So this photo is no longer accurate, but we do have 3 local officials on the BDAC, one elected official, a city employee, David Young, who's the Fiber and Rights of Way manager for the city of Lincoln. I believe he's speaking here as well. And Larry Hansen, the executive director of the Georgia Municipal Association. Ah, yes, I see him. Hi, David. And they have really punched above their weight in this group. You know, they are only 10% of this committee of 30. They have put in an enormous amount of work. And while I don't think that a group that is balanced so heavily in favor of industry could ever have the outcome that we want, I think they've done a really good job of mitigating harms. So currently, most of the working groups that make up the BDAC have concluded their work and presented final reports to the group. The major issues that still remain for the BDAC are finalizing a state model code, and then the next thing I'm going to mention, which is a new disaster recovery and response working group. This was announced by Chairman Pai at the most recent public meeting, and this group is still being appointed. It is intended to offer policy recommendations on broadband network resiliency, disaster recovery and response. One of the conversations that we did have with the FCC is that this was probably not the best time of the year to pull a group like this together with wildfire and hurricane season upon us. But unfortunately, the BDAC is only chartered through next March, so we are going to do the best we can with the time that we have. Applications for that close soon. I realize everyone is very busy, but I encourage you to share that information with any emergency managers or public safety officials you know. If you do know of local officials who are applying, or if you intend to apply, please let NLC and NATOA know so that we can support their candidacy. I think it's really important that we get a strong local government showing on this working group so that A, they're informed by the best emergency management and local government experience that we can offer, but also so that disaster response policy does not inadvertently weaken consumer protections or local government protections. There's a few other regulatory things, not necessarily at the FCC, that I wanted to touch on really quickly. One of them is the annual Section 706 report at the FCC. We'll probably be commenting on that. The 2 main issues to keep in mind about this are that this is the time of year when the FCC changes or reaffirms their speed definition for broadband. So there's been, yet again, some disagreement about whether that should stay the same, whether the speed definition is too fast, whether we should speed it up and make it more aspirational. There's also, the other thing that this report does is provide data on how many Americans have access to broadband. So both of those are very important on a policy level because they determine how other grant programs work, which areas get the most attention, and what policy decisions are made at every level of government. The next thing I wanted to touch on was the e-connectivity pilot at the Department of Agriculture. I mentioned that briefly at the beginning, but this is a new pilot program. It'll be focused on rural areas with populations of 20,000 people and below, and they are currently accepting feedback on how this program should operate. One of the things that I'm hoping to highlight in NLC's comments to the USDA is the importance of including municipal broadband networks and utility co-ops as eligible entities to participate, because so many rural communities either are looking at municipal broadband as a good option or have a utility co-op that would be a good candidate for extending broadband service into their community. Another thing that is going on at the FCC that is not necessarily focused on our usual areas of preemption is the telehealth pilot. They're looking at using some universal service fund money to launch a telemedicine pilot and figuring out ways to extend it just beyond normal telehealth hubs in communities. So outside of just medical centers, how can we get this closer to consumers, to low-income or elderly people and veterans who can't travel, especially in rural areas, maybe an hour to the nearest VA hospital or even further. So comments on that are also due in September. And I should mention, I know everyone downloads the slides after this conference, so all of those underlined things link to the proceedings, so you can access that. You don't need to take a photo and write it all down and look it up. And then finally, the other thing I did want to highlight in terms of regulatory activity is the Mobility Fund 2 challenge process. That, for those of you who aren't familiar, that is the process by which state, local, and tribal governments, along with other providers, can challenge the data that the FCC is using to determine which areas are eligible for mobile broadband infrastructure subsidies. So providers will bid on certain areas on the map to provide subsidized service in those places. Earlier this year, all of the providers contributed data to the FCC about where their coverage reaches. But especially in areas where there might only be one provider, it's possible that an area is listed as having unsubsidized service when maybe it doesn't. So especially if you live in a rural area, if you have a jurisdiction with some areas that have spotty service or rural sections, they have extended the deadline for challenging that data. So if you haven't looked at it, I really, really, really encourage you to go look at the FCC's challenge, or the FCC's Mobility Fund map, look at your community, see if it makes sense. If not, you still have time to go out and test it and submit data. This is another thing. I would encourage you to share that with your networks. This will determine the next 10 years of mobile subsidy funding. It is incredibly important. Okay, so now that I have depressed everybody and we've been talking about preemption all afternoon, I wanted to end on a high note and talk about what it is that local governments can do and what we can do for each other. So the first one is the new Small Cell Wireless Infrastructure Municipal Action Guide and Model Ordinance, which were released yesterday. I would say it's hot off the presses, but I don't even have a printed copy yet, so that's how new it is. If you want to access that online, I didn't have the link when I put this deck together, but it's at www.nlc.org/smallcell, all one word. This guide is not intended to be a Bible for small cell issues. In fact, if you're in this room, it may be a little too basic for you. But we interviewed 5 cities around the country and put together case studies of how they have worked on small cell deployment in their communities. And it's really intended for maybe your elected officials or your less technically focused colleagues in your community, to explain what this is, how it fits into a network, how it can benefit your residents, what some of the pitfalls to look out for are. And then we paired it with a model ordinance that we developed with NATOA to offer people something tangible that they could try and use. And I will mention that this ordinance is in no way, A, intended to be legal advice, but B, it is not intended to be a direction to cities. We are not telling you that this is what you need to do or that this is even the best way to do it. But we looked at the BDAC process and we didn't like how much it was being driven by industry, so we wanted to provide a similar alternative based on that kind of process and structure. Ultimately, you have to make your own decisions as a community, and we trust you to make the best decision for you. But especially for smaller and mid-sized communities, we thought it would be helpful to have a place to start. I would also say this is a good time to work with your state municipal leagues and NATOA chapters. We can't anticipate what the legal situation is in your state. That's the problem with a national model. It can't actually be a good solution for everybody. So work with your state leagues. A number of them have come up with model documents, model ordinances, model agreements, and those are a great place to start for something that focuses on your community. So more broadly, what can all of us do about this? If, like Tim says, the FCC already knows what it's going to do and we're all doomed forever, that's not really why any of us got into public service. But everybody here is a communicator, a storyteller, and I think we can all do a better job of telling our story and explaining why what we're doing and the decisions that cities are making are important to residents. For those of you who were in the session this morning with Shireen Santosham, I think the San Jose story is a great example of connecting something that is important to people, digital equity, broadband access in under-resourced communities, to the regulatory decisions that the city is making. But if we don't connect those dots for federal policymakers, they're not going to get there on their own. They're way too busy. They're focused on way too many other things. It's the same deal with your city councils. They're probably not really focused on your day-to-day issues because there's a pothole that needs filling, and that's a lot easier to understand than the intricacies of franchising or small cell deployment. All they know is that there's a problem and it needs to be fixed. So it's up to us to tell that story. And I think I encourage everybody here to be a little bolder about the kinds of advocacy that you're doing. I know a lot of your communities write comments to the FCC and other agencies or send letters, and I definitely encourage you to do that. If you've never done it before, that's what NLC and NATOA are here for. We can help you write templates. We can teach you how to navigate the FCC's comment filing system, because I don't know who designed it, but they really hate people. Or even just going lower tech, bringing people into your communities, taking them on tours. Your legislators are there for you. Take them into your offices and around your communities and have them look at stuff. That's the only way you'll understand it. And then I'm not going to talk about this a lot because you can download it and click on it, but I just thought it would be helpful, especially if you're not familiar with federal advocacy, to focus your efforts. There's a lot to keep track of. It's been a crazy couple of years. It's not going to get any less crazy. But just focusing in on a few specific committees and agencies, that's where the bulk of the work is going to happen. And if you have a legislator on one of those congressional committees who represents your state or your district, you should absolutely start a habit of sending them all of your press releases, all of your announcements, all of your good things. Get the brag habit going so that you have a positive relationship with them by the time you need to go and have a conversation with them about why you didn't like something that they did or why you want them to vote a certain way. You'll already have established that, and you'll already have credibility built up with them. And then finally, I am going to be completely selfish and put in a plug. The way that NLC puts together its advocacy program and the way that we set all of our policy positions on federal issues is through our committee system. Anyone who is an elected, appointed, or staff person at an NLC member city is eligible to be on one of our committees, and I desperately, desperately need more smart people on the Information Technology and Communications Committee. We need expertise, we need volunteers. It's not a huge time lift, but it is enormously helpful to cities around the country. So if you're in this room, and you are in an NLC member city, which hopefully you know because that was part of the registration process, I would encourage you to go check out this link and submit an application by the end of November, because we would love to have you. And with that, I think we have a little time left for questions.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm not going to, I guess you can applause if you'd like, because some of you started. And we're gonna jump right into questions, because I know we're staying between you and your drinks at the happy hour, so we'll go right away. Yep.
Sure, I appreciate the question. For those that didn't hear it, why would the industry be seeking market rates in one instance and then for localities a set capped rate? So I think there's a difference between negotiating between two different corners of private commercial real estate where you have folks looking to negotiate in the open market. I think it goes to what Angelina mentioned, that this is perhaps a philosophical difference. But local communities have a monopoly on their rights of way and the infrastructure, municipal property there. So it's not quite an open, free market where we can go in Fairfax County to another government entity that has management rights in that right of way. So I think that, along with consistency and clarity, is something that we saw the state of Virginia take up in their two past state sessions, to give industry a better idea of what those rates and fees would be.
So you're talking about property that is only municipal property to which there's no private competition, no privately owned buildings or anything different substitute?
I don't know if the distinction's that it's, the right of way, which would be managed in Virginia. There's the Virginia Department of Transportation, which had a carve out, I believe, a little bit different. So the government entities, there's only one Department of Transportation per community, and so it's not like I can go next door and still serve communities, constituencies within that group. So it's a it's not an open market. It's more akin to monopoly structure, where there's only one entity we can negotiate with.
I'll call my boss, Ken Fellman.
Sure. I'll take your first question first, and appreciate the question. I think, as others have said on the panel, it's been a very busy couple of years, and I started my presentation with the demand that consumers have for data, whether it's 4G or 5G. It's extreme, and so every venue across the country, state, federal, local, is taking this on. As far as inconsistencies go on the Thune-Schatz bill, as was mentioned, it's been introduced in the Senate and the committee. It hasn't had the hearing yet, and there's no House companion. And so part of the conversations, the very specific conversations we're having with those offices and the members of the Commerce Committee are ensuring that the work that's been done in the states is not disrupted, and so this deployment is not slowed. So we're trying our best to ensure that it's a streamlined approach and everything is comported.
Just to follow up on that,
sure.
Would it be fair to say that WIA's position is, to the extent that 3157 conflicts with the state law prevails?
No, I think we wouldn't go that far as to look at how that. It's still in a form that hasn't been heard, and so we're looking at that. There are aspects within the bill that don't look at the volumetric and cumulative limits like some of the state bills do, and we still have the pending FCC order. So, folks want 5G across America, and every community and every elected official that's looking to talk about it, we're going to share what the opportunities are. The second point of the question, I think what Congress did address much of, I think that the question of municipal or commercial poles in some of the 253 sections of the Telecom Act, as far as investor-owned utilities.
Actually, 224, the pole attachment.
224, 250. Yeah, so 224. So that, in result, had the pole attachment order. There's the reverse preemption, which we heard about. 2 years ago, we were in the state of Ohio, and they had gotten reverse preemption rights by certifying to the FCC that they'd have neutral, non-discriminatory rates and fees and timelines and those sorts of things so that they could administer the poles in their rights of way. And they had that right in 1976, and then there was no action thereafter. And so ultimately in 2012, 2014, can't recall, the PUCO did adopt those rights.
Jerry in the back.
Happy to be here. Yeah. No, I think, let me take that. So the mobility fund, though, is one of the aspects that is used to address externalities in communities and funding and access to telecom services, which WIA supports largely to get more telecom out to rural communities, underserved areas. So to those bills do not include those sorts of funding, no. Sure. So we did a survey of deploying on federal lands, and let me tell you, 5G needs to go everywhere, and so we're not hitting one constituency versus another. On the federal land space, we polled our members internally, and let's say for naval bases, we found that it was a 7-year process from wanting to be on that site until actually deploying. We went to the Navy with maps and all sorts of things like that. Internally, they found it was a 9-year process. Our starting point wasn't 270 days. It was more akin to the 60-day, 120-day shot clock. But this is turning a carrier around, a carrier battleship, around. We'll take 270 days with the promise that they're going to look to deploy more quickly for the warfighter and the families that live on those communities. It's not fast enough. You look at maps of what's available on federal lands versus commercial property. It's total dead zones. And it's not for want of carriers wanting to be there. It's because of a process that doesn't exist and a structure where no one has ultimate control over yes or no. So it's a different sort of process, and then you go from federal land that's NPS controlled to BLM for easements, and you have 5 different federal agencies to speak with, each with their own process and no funding. Absolutely not. It's your communities, it's your constituencies that want this data. We are trying to serve our customers, your constituents, with what they're demanding. And so 7 years wouldn't be enough if we want to lose the race to South Korea. Those are the sorts of things that could occur.
All right, this has got to be the last question. So the woman in the blue.
Sure. So I'm not sure of the details of that. I'm not sure that they're members. If you want to share with, I'm happy to look into it. Okay.
This is happening everywhere, because I've talked to some of my co-hosts here, and it's happening in other places where we approve permits, and then you want to tell our
Yeah.
representatives
Well,
that we're holding you up, and you haven't built anything.
so this,
Permit for a year.
understood. And this is all private capital, right? So this isn't funded by congressional action or taxpayer money. This is private capital that is attributed to a quarterly build-out requirement. So in some cases, you know, if it's a year long, that money could have been moved elsewhere. But without knowing the details, I couldn't comment on that specifically.
Sorry, is that your position on the film shots bill, that you should only have to comply with that deadline if you've identified capital to be able to build that? Because what you're saying is, we have to jump through the hoops to approve these things on a fast track basis. But you just said, if you can feel free to move the
Yeah.
capital around.
No, that's not what I'm saying. There are build-out requirements that the FCC administers for spectrum holders, and so folks that hold spectrum are required to build out, and so those are the things that the FCC would look at. I'm not sure that the two equate as you're mentioning, and I don't know the details of your community.
But I guess just generally, you've gone through a dozen states and preempted. Do you have a sense in those states how many small cells you've deployed?
So I wouldn't characterize it that we went to 12 states and preempted. 20 democratically elected legislatures, many bipartisan, chose to enact this legislation, and those governors signed it. Lying lobby.
But, okay, but let's say, in the democratic process, at least today, I mean, I don't dispute the fact, these bills were voted on, and people elected them because there was a sense, like you just said, South Korea, that we had to do this because 5G is coming and we have to be prepared. And we can't have 150-day shot clocks, we have to get them down to 60, and we have to be able to have deemed granted if we don't act. And this woman here just talked about, they went in a small community and moved those permits.
Yeah.
Does WIA believe that there should be, for people who get these permits, a requirement that you use them within a specific period of time?
I'd have to know the details of this situation. I don't know if this is a member of WIA, and I can't broadly speak to that. Okay.
All right, well, thanks for the vigorous debate we just had. You know what you're going to do.
That's why they pay you the big bucks.